Hey guys, tonight we ride straight into the smoky, gritty, and occasionally questionable kitchens of the Wild West, where saloons served up mystery meat, outlaw stew, and enough black coffee to wake the dead. So, before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It helps a ton and makes sure you never miss another strange, savory story from history. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is. It's always fun to see who's listening while the world sleeps. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Because in the old frontier, breakfast wasn't just the most important meal of the day. It was often the last thing cooked before a gunfight. The Secret on the Back Stove, a tale of squirrel fricassee if you followed the main road down through the Missouri hills, past the abandoned sawmill and the graveyard with half its stones leaning like drunkards, you'd come upon a crooked saloon tucked between two cottonwoods. It had no sign, no windows that matched, and a floor that creaked like it wanted to confess something. But inside, if you came at the right hour, right after sundown but before the drunks got too bold, there was a smell that wrapped around you like a memory you didn't know you missed. That smell was squirrel fricassee. Not that it was on the menu. Hell, there wasn't a menu. Just a chalkboard that still had last Tuesday's spelling of beer scratched on it and a note that said, "N.O. tabs." But if you were local, if you knew the knock and didn't insult the barkeep's haircut, you might get a whisper, "Back stove's runnin' hot tonight." That's all you needed to hear. Behind the saloon, in a space that used to be a laundry room and still had a clothesline nailed to the rafters, a woman named Etta stirred something rich and white and bubbling. She wore a soot-streaked apron, a kerchief around her head, and a butcher's knife tucked into her waistband like it was part of her hand. "What's cookin', Etta?" asked a boy with freckles and ambition. She didn't look up, just dropped another chunk of meat into the gravy. "Squirrel," she said. The boy blinked. "Real squirrel. You think I'd lie about meat that talks back when you shoot it?" she said, eyes narrowing. "Go wash your hands if you want a plate." That was the rule. Etta didn't care how many men you'd gunned down or how many horses you could steal in an hour. If your hands were dirty, you didn't get a spoon. The fricassee started early that morning. Before the sun rose, Etta was out with her long gun and her traps, quiet as the dawn. Squirrel season never really ended in these parts. The little buggers were everywhere. Oak, hickory, walnut. Trees full of twitchy tails and beady eyes. You had to be fast, steady, and patient. She'd cleaned them before noon. Peeled the hides, gutted them clean, soaked the meat in cold water to draw out the wild. Then came the dredging, not with fancy breadcrumbs or French flair, but with flour, salt, and pepper. She browned the pieces in bacon grease, let them crisp, then pulled them out and made the gravy right there in the same pan. Flour, milk, the drippings, and a whisper of dry thyme she kept in a jar that used to hold bullets. Then the meat went back in slow heat. Long simmer. By the time the sun touched the top of the trees, the meat was fall off the bone tender. Bathing in creamy, peppery richness, she served it with biscuits. Not the fluffy ones like in New Orleans, but flat, pan-baked bread with a crunchy crust and a heart like cornbread. The kind that didn't cry when you poured gravy over it. The regulars showed up like moths to the steam. First came Otis, the blacksmith, hands like anvils and a voice like thunder. He always asked for 2 biscuits and never used a fork. Then Mildred, the preacher's widow, who never looked up when she ate, just closed her eyes and let the flavor remind her of when things weren't so quiet. Then, of course, Caleb. Caleb was trouble, but the good kind. The kind who could shoot the eye out of a hawk at 50 paces, but always said thank you when handed a plate. He slid in through the back door, brushed the dust off his coat, and nodded. "Smells like autumn," he said. "Smells like squirrel," Etta replied. He grinned. "Same thing around here." He took a seat at the side table, the one under the coat hooks where the candle never burned right, and dug in. He didn't speak for a long while. Then he said, "You know, I used to think squirrel was poor man's meat." "It is," Etta said. "And this tastes like a rich man's dream." She raised an eyebrow. "That's 'cause rich men don't know what to do with scraps. That was the secret to squirrel fricassee. You didn't cook it to impress. You cooked it to survive, and then you learned how to make it taste like more than just survival." In the woods of Arkansas, Missouri, Kentucky, and Tennessee, squirrel had always been part of the diet. You grew up with a rifle in one hand and a biscuit in the other. You learned to clean a squirrel before you could spell your own name. It wasn't exotic. It wasn't shameful. It was dinner. And in the saloons, it became comfort. It wasn't served at high noon or during the rush. Came out late. For the tired. For the quiet. For the folks who didn't want steak or beans or flapjacks but wanted something that reminded them of the time before their hands shook and their boots squeaked. You had to know it was there. And if you didn't, you'd never know what you missed. A newcomer stumbled in, young, maybe 17, covered in dust and too much pride. He'd been riding alone, probably had no money, and looked like he hadn't had anything hot in days. He smelled the fricassee and blinked. "What's that?" Etta didn't answer, just pointed at the back table. He sat down, and she brought him a plate. He looked at it for a long time. At the creamy gravy, at the biscuits soaking it up, at the browned meat, which didn't look like anything he'd ever seen at a restaurant, but smelled better than anything he could remember. "What kind of meat is it?" "Squirrel," she said, his face twisted. "Really? You hungry or picky?" He paused, then picked up the fork. The first bite made him stop. His shoulders lowered. His hand stopped shaking. This don't taste like squirrel. It tastes like what squirrel becomes," she said, "when it's treated right." Outside, the wind picked up. Trees rustled. The sky darkened to a deep purple streaked with orange. Inside, the last of the fricassee vanished and no one spoke. They just ate, like it was sacred. The biscuits that wouldn't break. A tale of corn dodgers. The wind had teeth that day, sharp, bitter, and full of grit. It swept across the plains like it had something to prove, pulling at coats and kicking up clouds of dust that clung to your boots and your bones. But inside the saloon, a creaky building with one shutter missing and a tin roof that danced when the wind howled, something hot was waiting on the stove. Not whiskey. Not stew. Biscuits, corn dodger biscuits, to be exact. They sat piled high on a dented tin tray near the hearth, stacked like cannonballs. No flour dust, no fancy folds. Just rough, golden lumps of grit and glory, still steaming from the pan. You could smell the smoke in them, the fire, the fat. And if you were smart, you didn't wait long to grab one before Sam got to him. That man could eat 6 Dodgers in one sitting and still have room to ask what was for dessert. Behind the bar, Georgia May, the saloon's cook and part-time bouncer, wiped her hands on her apron and eyed the tray like it owed her rent. Her hair was tied back with a piece of old rope, and her sleeves were rolled up past her elbows, revealing forearms that had broken noses and kneaded dough in equal measure. A man stepped up to the counter, eyeing the biscuits with suspicion. "They hard?" he asked. "They're honest?" she shot back. "Which is more than I can say for most men in here." He chuckled and took one. First mistake. He bit it straight. Second mistake. He didn't have molasses. The biscuit didn't break. Pushed back. His jaw worked like a mule grinding gravel. Georgia May just raised an eyebrow. "You chew that fast," she warned. "You'll dislocate something." But as he kept going, something changed. His chewing slowed. His eyes narrowed, and then a nod. "This tastes like home." "Depends on what home you had," she said, slapping down a plate of beans beside him. "Mine didn't have butter or sugar. We had cornmeal, water, and lard, and you learned to like it or starve." That was the heart of the corn dodger. Simple, rugged, relentless. Just cornmeal, boiling water, a pinch of salt, and, if you were lucky, a spoonful of bacon grease or pork drippings. You rolled them in your palm into thick, oval shapes, then either fried them in a skillet, baked them on a rock, or shoved them right into the coals and hoped they didn't catch fire. No fluff. No fluffin', just food that fought back. They got their name on the trail, where cowboys would cook them over a fire and dodge them out of the pan before they burned. They were dense, dry, and tough enough to survive 3 days in a saddlebag without crumbling. You could throw one at a coyote and make it think twice. In saloons, they were standard fare, served beside beans, stew, meat, or even on their own with molasses if the rail had delivered recently. Tonight was a molasses night. A jar, thick and slow as tar, sat at the end of the bar. Folks dipped biscuits in it like it was gold, which, in a way, it was. One of the old ranch hands tore a dodger in half. Steam escaped like breath from a sleeping mule and smeared it with the dark syrup. He took a bite and groaned low. "Now that's a mouthful," he muttered. "Tastes like grit with a kiss." Georgia May smirked. "That's about how life goes." More folks came in, some just for drinks, others drawn by the smell. The dodgers disappeared one by one, chewed with reverence, cursed with affection. A young cowboy, new to town, reached for the last one before his fingers could close around it. A little girl, no more than 10, slid in like a shadow and snatched it from the tray. The cowboy blinked. "That yours?" She didn't speak, just bit into it with the confidence of someone who'd grown up chewing leather straps and liking it. Georgia May watched with amusement. "That's little Bess. Don't arm wrestle her unless you enjoy losing." The cowboy grinned and ordered a fresh plate. "You make these every day?" he asked. "Only when the wind's bad," she said. "Nothing holds heat like a corn dodger. You eat 2 of 'em, your belly stays warm till sunrise." He took a bite of the new batch, still hot, smoky, laced with just enough pork fat to taste like sin. "I thought biscuits were soft," he mumbled through the chew. "These are frontier biscuits," Georgia May replied. "Ain't here to comfort you. They're here to keep you alive." That was the thing. In the cities, folks talked about fluff and rise and butter to flour ratios. Out here, the only ratio that mattered was food to survival. Corn dodgers didn't pretend to be fancy. They didn't need yeast. They didn't spoil. They didn't complain. They traveled, they kept, and when you were hungry, they didn't ask questions. They just filled the space. One cowboy kept a pear wrapped in cloth inside his bedroll. Said if he didn't eat 'em by dawn, he used 'em to patch holes in his boots. Another swore they were good for bruises. A third, possibly drunk, once claimed he used one to plug a bullet hole in a wagon wheel. Whatever the truth, the legend held up by night's end. The tray was empty, and the molasses jar nearly so. Georgia May wiped her hands and leaned on the counter. "I ought to charge extra for those," she muttered. "They're worth it," someone called. "Damn right they are," she replied. "But next time y'all can roll your own. My arms are tired." The fire crackled low. The wind howled high, and the last crumbs of cornmeal were swept off the counter like dust in a world that didn't wait for anyone. The jar on the bar, a tale of pickled eggs. No one remembered when the jar first showed up that it had always been there. Squatting at the far end of the bar at the Spur and Saddle Saloon, like a cloudy glass sentinel, daring you to look too long or ask too many questions. Inside, eggs, dozens of them, pale, floating like ghostly moons in a brine as murky as memory, seasoned with seeds and pepper flakes and mystery. Some said they were chicken, others swore by duck, quail, or worse, but all agreed on one thing: they were pickled, and they were powerful. The barkeep, a man named Garth with shoulders like barrels and a face like he'd been kicked by a mule in slow motion, kept that jar clean, sealed, and stocked. He never said much about it. Just tapped the lid once every night like you might pat the head of a sleeping dog. Part superstition, part warning. It was nearing midnight when the first egg got pulled. The saloon was quiet in that dangerous way. Cards had stopped clacking. The piano player had wandered off to flirt with disappointment. And the only sound was the low murmur of boots scraping against wood. Then came the voice. "I'll take one." Heads turned. It was the kid, tall, skinny, maybe 21, maybe drunk. Hair like hay, eyes full of something stupid and brave. He slapped a nickel on the bar like he'd just bought land. Garth didn't blink. He reached for the jar, lifted the lid with reverence, and dipped in a thick pair of tongs that had once pulled bullets out of a sheriff's leg. He plucked out a single egg, slick and glistening, and dropped it into a dented tin dish. The kid picked it up like it was a dare, which, of course, it was. He took a bite. The room held its breath. His eyes watered. His jaw locked. His soul briefly exited his body. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Damn," he whispered. "That's good." And just like that, pickled eggs were back in fashion. They weren't new. Hell, they were old before the West was even wild. Saloons used to make them in batches big enough to scare a bishop. Hard-boiled eggs steeped for weeks in a vinegar solution filled with salt, mustard seed, garlic, peppercorns, and, depending on who made them, beet juice, chili, or something unholy and flammable. They didn't need fire. They didn't need refrigeration. They lasted longer than most marriages and didn't spoil if you forgot them behind a whiskey barrel for 2 seasons. That made them perfect bar food, especially when you were broke. Garth kept the price low. A nickel for 1, a quarter for 5, and a slap to the back of the head if you tried to steal from the jar. Some folks ate them plain. Others dipped them in salt, hot sauce, or horseradish. A few cracked them into their beer and swirled the mess around like they were conjuring demons. Nobody judged. Not in a town where folks drank turpentine when the whiskey ran out. Around 12:30, an old miner named Clem shuffled in. Beard down to his ribs. Smelled like pickles and dynamite. He saw the dish on the bar and grinned a crooked grin. "Pickled, huh? Still bite back," Garth replied. Clem plopped into a stool and waved a coin. "Let's see if I still got what it takes." Garth served him 2. Clem bit in like he was kissing an old flame, one that still owed him money. He chewed, swallowed, smacked his lips and sighed. Tastes like the first time I got paid and punched on the same night. By 1 o'clock, the jar was half empty, and the bar was full of stories. Everyone had one dot about the time they ate 6 eggs and tried to ride a pig dot, or how a pickled egg saved their life during a shootout, though how exactly was never clear dot, or the famous tale of Miss Jolene, who once ate 12 in a row on a dare and got proposed to by 3 different men, one of whom was already married to her sister. Pickled eggs weren't just food. They were frontier folklore. Edible memories soaked in sour and spice. A man from Texas said he used to eat one before every poker game for luck. Another swore it cured his hangover, his bad knee, and his ex-wife's curse. Garth just kept refilling the jar. Quiet, patient, deadly accurate with the tongs. Then, around 2 in the morning, the preacher walked in. Now, this preacher wasn't your typical soft-spoken Bible boy. He had a past. Wore boots with spurs. Kept a flask in his coat. And when he sat at the bar and asked for 2 and a prayer, Garth didn't even flinch. 2 eggs. A shot of rye. No questions, he downed them both, wiped his mouth and said, "That'll get a man through a storm," and he wasn't wrong. Pickled eggs didn't just fill your belly. They anchored your soul. They gave you something solid in a world of dust and regret. You could be broke, alone, hunted, or forgotten. But if you had a pickled egg, you had control, at least for a moment. By dawn. The jar was nearly empty. Garth sealed it tight and pushed it back to the corner. Someone asked, "You gonna refill it tomorrow?" Garth just grunted. "Only if the chickens cooperate." Someone else laughed. Someone else belched, and outside, the sky began to glow. In the Wild West, where fortunes were made and lost over one hand of cards, and the only thing more dangerous than a pistol was a promise. The humble pickled egg endured cloudy, sour, strong, just like the men who ate them. The biscuit that broke teeth. A tale of hardtack and gravy. The storm had rolled in hard that evening. The kind that painted the plains gray and made the air feel thick with old regrets. Rain came sideways, the kind that slapped windows and punched through the seams in your coat. Horses kicked in their stalls. The wind rattled the shutters on the 3-spoke saloon like a thief trying to get in. Inside, it was warm. Not cozy. Nothing in that place was ever cozy, but warm enough to keep the damp out of your bones. The fire crackled low in the corner. The smell of wet boots and whiskey filled the air. And something else. Something strange. A smell like flour and fat, browned in haste. A kind of gluey richness that hit the back of your throat and told your stomach to shut up and listen. Gravy. And beneath it, something harder. Something older than time and tougher than trail leather. Hardtack. A cowboy by the name of Dan Jawbreaker Mason sat at a corner table, gnawing thoughtfully on what looked like a broken brick slathered in beige gravy. He chewed slow, methodical, like he was solving a puzzle with his molars. A younger man, rain dripping from his coat and wide-eyed from his first week out of Texas, sat across from him, watching with horror. "What the hell is that?" the kid asked. Dan glanced up, mouth full. "Dinner." The kid leaned in. "Looks like building material." "Is building material," said a voice from the bar. "For your belly. Keeps you standin'." That voice belonged to Nettie, the cook, barkeep, and unofficial mayor of the saloon. She was scraping a skillet with a bent fork and scowling at a pan of rapidly thickening gravy. "More like keeps your dentist in business," the kid muttered. Dan chuckled. "Dentists don't come out this far. That's why we eat slow." Hardtack wasn't born in saloons. It was born on the battlefield, in ship hulls, and in the bellies of men too stubborn to starve. Flour, water, salt, that's it, and no sugar. No yeast. No hope. You kneaded it, rolled it, and baked it until it was the consistency of oak. Then you let it sit not for hours but weeks. The longer it aged, the tougher it got. If it didn't shatter your teeth, it would outlive you. They called it toothbreaker, molar snapper, and sheetrock surprise. But it lasted in the days before canned beans and jerky in a foil bag. Hardtack was your best friend and worst enemy. You carried it in saddlebags, bedrolls, even tucked inside boots when times were tight. It didn't spoil. It didn't cry. It just sat there waiting to hurt you. Unless you had gravy. That was the trick. That was the salvation. You didn't eat hardtack. You soaked it. In water, broth, coffee, whatever you had. Let it sit long enough, it softened just enough to fool your jaw. But if you were really lucky, you poured gravy on top. And not city gravy. Trail gravy. Made from pork drippings, salt, black pepper, maybe onions if the barrel hadn't run dry. You cooked it in the same skillet you used to kill a snake with. Stirred it until it bubbled. Then you poured it hot over the hardtack, letting it melt the outer layer and sink into the cracks. That was how you made hardtack eatable. That was how you made it comforting. The kid finally sat down and poked a biscuit with his fork. This doesn't look like food. Dan shrugged. Looks ain't everything. It'll keep you ridin'. The kid took a bite. His teeth met resistance. Then more resistance. Then, he chewed. Thoughtful. Damn, he muttered. Tastes like wallpaper paste. Add pepper, Nettie said, sliding him a tin shaker. He did. Another bite. It's not bad, he admitted. That's the gravy talkin', Dan said. If Nettie ever dies, this saloon folds. I'll die when the gravy runs out, she snapped, and she meant it. Folks came in every night for whiskey and cards, but the regulars, the ones who looked like they'd slept in their saddles and bled on their spurs, they came for the plate. Hardtack and gravy. Served hot, no apologies. 3 hardtack biscuits, soaked and buried under a tidal wave of trail sauce. It came with a side of sass and a wooden spoon that had survived more brawls than the sheriff. Old Man Higgins said it cured his cough. Little Lenny swore it gave him visions. Even Preacher Cole, who hadn't eaten meat since the war, said he made an exception for Nettie's gravy. You ever serve this in the city? The kid asked. Nettie laughed so hard her gravy pan rattled. This? In the city? She cackled. City folks got teeth like china dolls. They'd sue me. Dan nodded. Takes a certain kind of person to appreciate this meal. What kind's that? The kid asked. Dan leaned in. The kind that's been cold, broke, hungry, and too proud to cry. The kind that sees a slab of bread made of stone and says, "Yeah, I'll eat that." The kid went quiet, took another bite that didn't speak again until the plate was clean, and even then, he just asked for more to be by the time the storm passed. The fire was low, the bar was quiet, and the plates were empty. Nettie wiped her hands and leaned back. Not bad for leftovers and pig grease, she said. Dan raised his cup. To hard times, hard bread, and the gravy that makes it go down. The roast that built a reputation. A tale of buffalo roast. The first thing you noticed was the smell that he hit you before the swing doors even creaked open. before your boots scuffed the warped floorboards, before your hand reached for whiskey or your eyes adjusted to the flickering lamplight. It was meat. Not just any meat, buffalo. Not boiled, not stewed, not fried in some desperate pan of lard. Roasted. Slow roasted over open flame, until the air inside the saloon turned thick with smoke and longing. They served it only on Fridays at the Silver Horn, the only saloon between Cheyenne and the Devil's Backbone Ridge that boasted a whole spit pit behind the bar. They didn't advertise it. They didn't need to. Word traveled like wildfire on the plains, and when it was Buffalo Friday, the cowboys came, and they came hungry. Behind the bar stood Luther, half man, half legend, known for his handlebar mustache and the hunting knife he wore at all times. Not for fighting, but for slicing. Luther didn't just cook buffalo, he delivered salvation by the slab. That night, the fire was low and hot. The meat was basted every half hour in a mix of fat, wild sage, and coarse salt, and the line was already forming. Before dusk, a ranch hand named Garrett leaned over the bar and whispered like he was asking for absolution. "Is it hump meat tonight?" Luther nodded once. "Hump roast." Garrett nearly wept. See, on the open plains, buffalo wasn't just food. It was history. It was currency. It was legend. Before cattle took over and barbed wire sliced up the land, the buffalo ruled the West. They weren't just hunted, they were revered. A good hump roast, the thick, marbled meat from the shoulder, was as prized as gold dust. But it wasn't easy to get. By the 1870s, the buffalo were already dwindling. Herds that once stretched to the horizon were now shadows. Hunting parties traveled for days just for one shot, and if you brought one in, you'd earned the right to roast. Luther had a deal with a Cree trapper up north. Quiet man, carried a bow, smelled like pine. He'd show up once a month with cuts wrapped in leather and tied with twine. No small talk, no handshake, just meat and nods. That week, Luther had a roast the size of a saddlebag. He rubbed it down with dried herbs, salt, and bear fat. Let it sit overnight. Then set it on a spit he'd welded himself from iron rail spikes. The fire was oak and mesquite, low and patient, turning the roast slowly over flame until the skin crackled and the fat hissed. By nightfall, it was ready. He carved it thick. None of that paper slice nonsense. A Luther slice was 3 fingers wide and as long as your palm. He laid it across tin plates beside a ladle of pan gravy and a slab of roasted potatoes. No garnish. No flair. Just honest, red meat, glistening with its own glory. The first bite was a revelation. It wasn't like beef. It was darker, richer, with a deep, earthy flavor. Like the prairie itself had been cooked into every fiber. Tender if cooked right. Powerful, even when chewed slow. A man from Denver chewed and muttered, "Tastes like thunder and forgiveness." No one questioned it. The buffalo roast had rules. You didn't insult it. You didn't drown it in sauce. And if you were lucky enough to get the end piece with all the char and crust, you shut up and said thank you. That night, a gambler from St. Louis tried to cut the line. He claimed he was starving and had important guests. Luther looked up from the roast. "You think you're the first hungry man in here?" The gambler stammered. "But no one cuts in line for buffalo," Luther said. The room went quiet. Even the roast seemed to hold its breath. The gambler backed up. Fast. That was how serious folks were about this meat. It wasn't just a meal. It was a ritual. Some drank whiskey with it. Others sipped black coffee. A few just sat there, eyes closed, chewing slow like they were trying to remember a song their mother used to hum. A boy asked, "Why's it so special?" An old cowboy, boots worn, coat patched, face like aged leather, leaned in. "Because it's the last thing that still tastes like the West." The boy blinked. "What do you mean?" "Everything else got changed," the cowboy said. "Beef's from Kansas. Chickens come in crates. But buffalo? That's still wild. Still full of thunder. You taste that, and you remember what this place was before fences and trains." The boy nodded, took another bite that didn't speak again for a long time. By midnight, the roast was gone. Just bones and drippings and the quiet satisfaction of a room full of men who'd eaten like kings. Luther wiped his knife, set it down, and finally poured himself a drink. "You ever roast beef like that?" someone asked. Luther shook his head. "You roast beef like that, you end up with beef. You roast buffalo like that, you end up with a story." And sure enough, they told stories of hunts that lasted weeks, of near misses and lucky shots, of sharing the meat with men who didn't survive the winter, of sitting by the fire with your belly full and the world quiet for once. Buffalo roast didn't just fill you up. It reminded you why you came west in the first place.